over the last few years, an international audience has discovered what a lot of connoisseurs have known for years, and that is the great artist Mariano Fortuny. And this is your great addition to the collection, which I've seen. I saw it here. I saw the retrospective in Madrid, the Fortuny retrospective, which was long overdue. The Meadows Museum, I'm happy to say, I'm not surprised because Mark is very inventive. The Meadows Museum led the revival of Fortuny, was in the forefront, and Fortuny finally got his retrospective at the Prado, but it was 150 years too late. He's one of the great 19th century Spanish artists, and in his lifetime he was one of the most famous artists in the world, and I'll talk a little bit about what happened to his reputation, why American artists picked him up at a certain point in time, and why he disappeared, and maybe a question time afterwards we could talk about what led to his revival. My exposure to Fortuny dates to the mid-1990s when I started working at the Clark Art Institute, and I'll talk about a couple of pictures at the Clark. The Clark had the biggest collection, I think, in the country of 19th century Spanish art. Spanish art was a particular favorite of Sterling and Francine Clark. The small, very elegant cabinet pictures, we used to call them the ladies of the 80s, being most of them were done in the 1880s, and the Clark had 15 or 16 of them. And when I was a student at Williams, I guess, so that was a long time before, I fell in love with Fortuny, Rico, Madrazo, that whole circle of artists for their miniature sparkle, and I think that's one of the qualities that Fortuny, as the leader of that group, certainly had. He was a great painter, printmaker, influence maker, who was born in 1838, he died in 1874. He died at an early age, but he was, and here we can quibble, the most famous artist of his time. He was a young genius, well known in Rome, Venice, London, Paris, of course, and in the United States. He had a growing group of enthusiastic collectors as well as followers at a time when the center of the European art world, which was Paris, had an on-again, off-again love affair with Spanish style. But when the world of artists, whether in Paris or London or even in America, was in a state of flux, Fortuny was an experimenter, but he was also an academic, traditional painter. He was part of the circle of Orientalist artists, and I'll talk a little bit about Fortuny and Gérôme, who was the great Orientalist master. And many of his collectors in the 1860s and 70s collected mainstream establishment art. The first Impressionist salon happened the year of his death, so he was on the cusp, and indeed Fortuny was on a parallel track with Impressionism. A great love for plein air painting, putting a priority on capturing a moment, and this is a wonderful example of it. Fortuny as an artist had a distinct personal vision, which many of the Impressionists did. All the Impressionists were avant-garde artists. They were throwing an establishment over. He believed in exploring the intensity of nature seen freshly, and his forms might have been indistinct and brushstrokes irregular, but he was faithful to the integrity of the object. what he saw was, what we see was his emotional response to it. So in Fortuny, it was emotionalism and expressionism leavened by a great discipline and a great respect for the old masters, which was one of his attractions to Sargent and Eakins. Now, the Impressionists had theories of light and color, and they were in the 1870s at least mostly city painters, but the focus on honest experience, interpreting it, modifying it, and celebrating the texture and color of paint united Fortuny with what the Impressionists were doing. A big difference is that Fortuny was famous, and he was revered in his lifetime as a savant, and the others, the young Meadows, Renoir, Sisley, more so were not. So my lecture, and then when Fortuny died in 1874, his reputation was run over, flattened by the Impressionists, by the avant-garde in Paris that dominated modernist art movements for the next 30 or 40 years. But Fortuny was always well known in Spain, much loved in Spain. And Picasso, I'll talk a little bit at the end in question time about Picasso and Fortuny because I was thinking about that today. My lecture will look at a distinct phenomenon of 19th century art, which is how Americans responded to Spanish artists, especially to Fortuny, and how America from the 1830s or so until the turn of the century took the lessons of Fortuny, but other Spanish artists and figures in Spanish history to define themselves as citizens and develop their own unique cultural vision. So I'll start with early Spanish subject matter from the 1830s. I'll talk a few minutes about Washington Allston, who really pioneered the way Americans thought about Spain, American artists thought about Spain in the 19th century. I'll talk about two of the pictures in the Capitol Rotunda depicting scenes of Spanish exploration. I'll talk about Sargent. We'll keep coming back to Sargent over and over. El Jaleo from 1882 at the Gardner Museum is his great early tour de force. And I'll talk about Eakins, Thomas Eakins and William Merritt Chase and how they absorbed Spanish art and culture in the 1860s and 1870s. So we have three different artists, Chase, Sargent, and Eakins, and each took, they're very, very different people, roughly from the same generation, and each took from Fortuny and Spanish art different things, and very often Fortuny was the portal for American artists, introducing them to the splendors of Spanish Old Master painting. Fortuny was so famous, and he was known as a Spanish artist. He was distinguished as a Spanish artist, which separated him from French artists. He was, like a lot of American artists, he was different. He was Spanish in a sea of Frenchmen, but Americans, particularly young Americans, loved Fortuny's internationalism. They loved his vitality, they certainly loved his fame, and they loved his example as well. So, I want to talk about two things. I want to make the contrast, and this is a send-off to what Americans liked about Fortuny. I want to talk about Fortunyism versus, I mean, it doesn't sound like it doesn't roll off the tongue, Jeromeism. By using these two pictures, Fortuny's choice of a model from the late 1860s, early 1870s, he worked on it off and on, and Jerome's The Snake Charmer, which I knew very well at the Clark Art Institute. So I want to talk about the ingredients of Fortunyism and Gérômeism in these two pictures. Gérôme was born in 1824. He died in 1904. So he was old enough to be Fortuny's father. He was the master of French Orientalism in the 1860s and 70s. He was also one of the great teachers at the time. He was Eakins's teacher. Gérôme had over 2,000 students over a period of years when he was teaching in his own school and also at the École des Beaux-Arts. And Thomas Eakin was one of his students, one of his first, I think he was his first or second American student. Gérôme was at the zenith of the art establishment. His finish is tight. You see no evidence of the artist's brushstroke. There's a lascivious quality to it, certainly. It oozes otherness, the foreign and the forbidden. It's powerful stuff, but it's elusive, clinical, it's almost anthropological. There's a dissective quality to it. Its cold, hard surface contributes to it. It glitters, but it feels pretty sleazy, right, to me. And it became famous because it was on the cover of Edward Said's book, Orientalism, which was published in 1980 and became an icon for the kind of pernicious imperialism that Said was peddling as a theory, but that's another story. The figures look distant. They actually look pretty doped up. There's an atmosphere of idleness and great sumptuousness. The tile, this is really beautiful. These guys here are a pretty dodgy cast of characters. So it raises issues for an American viewer looking at this in the 1880s of race, transgression, the whole 9 yards. Now, choice of a model, which I love, Fortunyism. I'm using this because it's a nude. You've got this gal here, and you've got this young delinquent here, young man here. Fortuny is iridescent with vivacious brushstroke. It's a Rococo revival scene, and Fortuny loved Rococo revival. Rococo style goes in and out in France. It's one of the favorites of Fortuny, but for Fortuny, he loved Rococo art, 18th century French art, Fragonard, Boucher, that kind of thing, because of its softness, its playfulness, that spoke to him. For Gérôme, the brushwork is invisible. There's no evidence of the artist. In Fortuny, we see virtuoso brushwork and a strong love of light. Gérôme did lots of interiors, and most of them are quite dark, airtight, claustrophobic. Even his exterior scenes have very hard light. Fortuny's light is generous and celebratory. His figures have flesh. They're not hard as a rock. Everything is more tactile. The choice of a model was painted for Fortuny's principal collector, William Stewart, who was an American. In scenes like this, he evoked a world of beauty set in architecturally ornate settings, as did Gérôme. But Fortuny had enormous feeling and a new refinement of color. They're both portraying artificial worlds, but Fortuny's is playful and whimsical, without the slightest suggestion of danger. It's not a parody, but its artificiality has a great airiness to it. You're seeing a total imaginary world, but you're invited into it without a feeling that it's a world under a microscope and the subject for a scientific experimentation. So those are two things that are happening at the same time. Fortunyism and Gérômism. Fortuny is the new, the young, Gérôme is the old, and the establishment. So we go to Spanish Maiden in Reverie by Washington Allston. 50 years earlier, from 1831, it's quite a jarring contrast, and it's certainly a jarring contrast from Sargent. I'll start with Allston because, like Fortuny, he was internationally famous. He was arguably the first internationally famous American artist. But like Fortuny, also, he had a foot in multiple worlds. He lived off and on in England and in Rome, really spending most of his time from 1801 to 1819 living in Europe, mostly in London, where he became part of the circle of Wordsworth and other Romantic era writers, and he was Samuel Coleridge's best friend. We know she's Spanish because Allston conveniently wrote a poem that went with the picture. In treating the Spanish subjects, and Allston was one of the first Americans to do it, he picked a woman and he picked a medieval topic. The figure is named Inez, and it's set before the Reconquista, finished in 1492, so her world is pre-Columbian and pre-conquistador. She's passive, embedded in the landscape, a vulnerable, delicious little thing living in a world of reverie, a world of dreams, romance, and mystery. Allston feminizes Spain and makes her quiet, attractive, passive, and available. Now, where was America's head vis-a-vis Spain in the 1830s and 1840s? I'll show you a map. Well, the Spanish world was a subject very much in the minds of Americans. Spain was far away, yes, and America's direct foreign entanglements in the first 50 years of the country have been mostly with the French and with the British. But Spain was never far from the imagination. The fact was that Madrid might have been far away, but Spain, Spanish identity, Spanish language, Spanish acculturated peoples and land were right around the corner, and you know that in Texas better than we know in Vermont. By the end of the 1840s, America was at war with Mexico. It absorbed a vast part of Spanish America, among its new possessions being California and Texas, big parts of Texas. 50 years later, the end of the 19th century, and the ending more or less of the timeline for my talk, we were at war with Spain itself, delivering the final blow to the great Spanish Empire that once ruled a big part of the world and taking over most of Spain's colonial possessions. In the interim, off and on, Cuba was controversial. Our vast Spanish acculturated neighbors in the South remain in the news in fights over immigration, identity, assimilation, everything else. Long before Americans started going to Spain in the 1860s, and 1870s, among them Sargent, Chase, and Eakins, experiencing the country firsthand, Spain was a vivid part of the American imagination. The most important figure in influencing how Americans thought about Spain and about many other cultural issues was, of course, Washington Irving. Okay. No? Good. Irving is the most widely read American writer of the 19th century. In the 1820s, he was an American junior minister working for the Spanish government in Spain. His 1828 travelogue, Tales of the Alhambra, remains the best-selling English-language travelogue. It's gone through over 100 editions, and it's never been out of print. For Americans through the century, even cultural figures, Irving defined Spain and the definition hinged on its otherness. Spain was the antithesis of modern America, I would say, for better or for worse, since Irving had very affectionate feelings about his time in Spain, and he returned in the 1840s as America's ambassador to Spain, but his positioning of Spain was very much in opposition to American values. America was modern, a place of progress and change. Spain was passive. Its best days were behind it. Spain was tired. Spaniards were lazy. They were irrational. They did not value work. They were stuck in old ways, they weren't capitalists, they were feudal. They were locked in the timeless past, and America was a dynamic place. Irving also wrote the multi-volume biography of Christopher Columbus, which was the definitive biography of Columbus until the 1940s. And that picture was the basis of how Americans looked at Columbus and also looked at Spanish exploration. Now, John Vanderlyn completed the landing of Columbus in 1847 for the Capitol Rotunda. At the same time, William Powell finished the discovery of the Mississippi by DeSoto, which is also in the Capitol Rotunda. And these two works have been interpreted as celebrations of the European triumph of the American Indians. This is consistent with the themes of early rotunda pictures of historical reliefs, and each concerned early encounters of Europeans and Indians. However, I see a potential expression of different types of European colonizing experience. This expression evokes Spain as a powerful contrast to Anglo values and experiences. And I look, for instance, at Powell's picture of DeSoto discovering the Mississippi, and then looking at Robert Weir's embarkation of the Pilgrims, which is also in the Capitol Rotunda. Weir's pilgrims conquer through communal prayer, not through military force. The endorsement of God is sufficient to carry the day. Puritan children and women suggest the goal is permanent settlement. The orientation is towards a long-term future. Powell's picture offers no such themes. His presentation of DeSoto quotes the equestrian portraits of Spanish imperial kings by Velázquez. This raises the red flag of conquistador brutality, royalist corruption among the specialties of imperial Spain. Absent from the expedition are European women and children who presuppose family values. The two scantily clad, voluptuous, obviously frightened women, they're right over here, beneath the hooves of DeSoto's horse are Indian. This evinces the Anglo bugaboo of racial mixture between Spaniards and Indians. Powell's picture suggests the connivance of military and ecclesiastical elements in DeSoto's adventures, since soldiers and Roman Catholic priests are planting a large crucifix in the foreground. Okay, good. Now, in contrast, in the Capitol Rotunda, you see Trumbull's Declaration of Independence, which, in contrast to DeSoto, suggests how Anglos have established a civic society, which is through the rule of law, through constitutions. Okay, now, Vanderlyn's picture raises other issues. The landing of Columbus juxtaposes the European, large, sculptural, and centrally positioned against the smaller, marginalized Indians. But in the case of Columbus, and Washington Irving tries his best to pry Columbus away from Spanish identity. He positions him as an Italian, which is why Columbus Day is celebrated in New York and Chicago in Boston is the big Italian-American holiday. And he was not a conquistador, he was positioned as an explorer. So this was the American mindset when the three artists, Eakins, Sargent, and Chase, went to Spain. I'll start with Thomas Eakins, 1844 to 1916, the American realist painter and photographer and educator. Eakins lived most of his life in Philadelphia and began studying in 1861 in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. In those days, American art instruction was primitive. Very few Americans in the 1840s, 1850s went to Europe to study. If they went to Europe, they might take a course or two, but mostly they traveled around for a long time. Washington Allston lived there for a long time. Most American artists did something like a grand tour, but Eakins was one of the first American artists in the period after the Civil War to actually go to Spain. He did go to Spain, go to Paris, and he enrolled in the École des Beaux-Arts, which was the greatest art school in Europe, as a tuition-paying full-time student. And I think the dynamic might have been very similar to what we have here with a lot of Asian students who come to American universities. Eakins could pay the tuition, and so he was welcomed to as one of the first students in a French program. Eakins was part of the first generation of American artists immediately to study in Spain, and he studied in Paris with Gérôme from 1866 to 1869. Eakins spent a great deal of time in the Louvre, as did many young artists at the École des Beaux-Arts, since part of the program was looking at the old masters. Eakins was in Paris sometime before the Impressionist Salon in 1874, but he knew Fortuny's work, and he admired Fortuny a lot. Fortuny was already exhibiting in Paris. Fortuny, as far as Eakins was concerned, provided a jolt of energy that Eakins did not get from the old masters. He admired Fortuny's freedom more than anything else, his free handling with paint. He wrote about Fortuny's facility with paint and saw this young artist, famous artist, only a bit older than he as a role model. There are two basic things Eakins got from Fortuny. One was inspiration. Fortuny was young and international. He was a success at the highest levels of the establishment in the greatest art city in the world. But Eakins never had the surface sparkle of Fortuny. Remember, he was a student of Gérôme, and if you look at Eakins throughout his career, the finish is very tight. He has Gérôme's very tight finish. For Eakins, it was more aspirational, as much as he praised Fortuny. Fortuny was an exemplar, but he also saw Fortuny as having a vision that wasn't one dictated by the Paris establishment. Now, one of the things Fortuny's example, this is a Fortuny from 1867, which is about the time Eakins was in Paris. Eakins did nothing like this. He didn't do Orientalist subject matter. The subject matter was very different. For Eakins, Fortuny was an inspiration. He was always in the background. You'll see that in a couple of different ways. But Fortuny, as an inspiration for Eakins, being Spanish, Eakins did what very few American artists did. He went to Spain. In 1869, he spent a lot of time there. He spent a lot of time at the Prado. At that point, travel in Spain was very difficult. It wasn't comfortable. Madrid was a city that was a big city. It was a capital city, but it was still very much a backwater. It was never on the grand tour. When Eakins went to Spain, this is what he said. in a letter to his father. Since I am now here in Madrid, I do not regret at all my coming. I've seen big painting here. When I had looked at all the paintings by all the masters I had known in Paris, I could not help saying to myself all the time, it's very pretty, but it's not all yet. It ought to be better. But now I have seen what I always thought ought to have been done, and what did not seem to me possible. Oh, what a satisfaction it gave me to see the good Spanish work, so good, so strong, so reasonable, so free from early affectation. It stands out like nature itself. So saying that everything he had just seen before was pretty but not enough is surprising, since Eakins had just left the studio of Gérôme and lived in Paris for years, which was then the art capital of the world. How did Eakins respond to being in Spain? This is probably Eakins' first finished painting after he completed his studies in Spain. It's called Carmelita Riqueña. It's at the Met. It's from 1869. He's painting a girl. Eakins said she was a 17-year-old child of street performers he met when he was living in Seville in the winter of 1869. It's very modest, but at the time he had already looked at a lot of Spanish art at the Prado and was thinking of distinctly Spanish use of light with sharp contrasts between dark and light and simple, honest subject matter. He never returned to Spain, and he painted one very modest Spanish subject right after he painted this. This is Street Scene in Seville. He was inspired by Fortuny as a personality and as a young artist whose success he could aspire to, but Eakins very much kept his debt to Spanish art under his hat. He used it as his technical and compositional inspiration. It informed him and it gave him license to pursue his vision. One of Eakins' revelations when he went to Spain was the honesty of Spanish art, something that is counterintuitive since he was looking at Velázquez, who was a court painter of Philip IV. Eakins had started his instruction in art at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia in 1861, attending autopsies since he wanted to know how the human figure worked underneath skin. But in Velázquez, he saw an artist who was already thinking in those terms. He looked and admired this very early Velázquez at the Prado, a crucifixion from 1832. This crucifixion inspired his own crucifixion in 1880, and it's Eakins' only religious work. From the crucifixion in Madrid and also from paintings of the male figure he saw by Ribera in Spain, Eakins was motivated to rendering the human body with uncompromised realism, the sagging torso, stretched arms, and clenched hands, suggesting an actual male body hanging from a cross in the agony of his last moments. And to understand human anatomy, Eakins strapped a model, one of his students, on the cross. This picture is treated as an anomaly since it's Eakins' only religious painting. And at the time, the startling realism was considered inappropriate to a sacred subject, but he considered the painting one of his finest and important, and persisted in sending it to public exhibitions of his work throughout the United States until his death in 1916. So Eakins felt he demonstrated in this picture from 1880, still a young man, an academician's high level of technical expertise, but also his apologetic realism. And this picture, which I've thought about a lot, this is the picture in the Prado that Eakins admired the most, and he wrote about the most, which is the fable of Arachne, which is a picture that he saw in the the Prado, the fable of Arachne, this picture here, this is William Rush carving the allegorical figure from towards the end of Eakins' career. One of the things I like about this picture is I tend to look, when it comes to artists, I tend to look at the very early work, great artists, the very early work and their late work. I like looking at the juvenilia so I could see the seed of genius, but I also like looking at the late work, because at the late work, an artist is sick of his patrons, he hates the critics, he's only thinking about the things that essentially matter to him. And towards the end of his career, and Eakins painted William Rush many times, he came back to Fortuny, as did Sargent, which we'll see, but he came back to Fortuny in a background inspirational way, in the way he organized the figures. You have this figure in the foreground here, this figure here, you've got this vertical here, you've got this vertical here, you've got the artist William Rush working in the background. You've got background activity. The fable of Arachne was a Greek myth in which Arachne, who is a mortal woman, challenges the goddess Athena to a weaving competition. And remember the ad, it's not nice to fool Mother Nature. It's not nice to compete with a god. It never ends well for the human. Arachne wins the competition, and Athena is upset and turns her into a spider, and that's no fun, and that's why we have the term arachnophobia, fear of spiders. Now, Eakins did not know this story. It wasn't a story that scholars developed until the 1940s, but he did look at this. It was then called the Spinners. He looked at this in this sense, I think, to create a great work of art, both creativity and hard technical work was required. I think Eakins would have been able easily to intuit from looking at this picture that art embraced any creative activity, whether it's fine art or craft. It was all an expression of the human figure. So in the background, it was more inspirational. It was something that he filed away, and he kept thinking about Spanish art. He kept thinking about Velázquez for the rest of his career. And Eakins compositionally kept coming back to Velázquez. This is a picture you saw in the Prado in the 1630s. He developed that convention, and he used it over and over again. This is a thinker from 1900. Again, it's one of Eakins' most famous pictures, and again, it's towards the end of his career. He died in 1916, but he stopped painting around 1908, 1909. And he started petering out around 1900, but it's the focus on the figure with the most stripped down background possible. And he got that from Spanish art as well. So we'll go to Sargent. This is Sargent's self-portrait from 1906. Sargent is one of those artists, and the only parallel I can think of is Van Dyck, who really had no nationality. Sargent was born in 1856. In Europe. His father was a medical doctor. His father was based in Philadelphia. The family had some money. In the case of Sargent, Sargent's father, he wrote the manual that was used by Union doctors during the Civil War in how to treat bullet wounds. He wrote the manual on how to do that, and he became a famous medical doctor. He had some money. His wife loved traveling in Europe. They went to Europe in 1858 1954, and while they were in Europe, his wife decided that she had a severe fatal allergy to steamships, which meant that they could never come back. And they stayed, and Sargent was born in 1856 in Europe. He didn't come to the United States until he was 21 years old, and he had to come to America in order to keep his American citizenship, which he took great pride in, and he considered himself an American. And he made long painting trips to America. He did a big series of murals at the MFA in Boston. He did some American commissions, but mostly Sargent was an itinerant. His parents survived financially in Europe from moving from spa town to spa town, arriving just at the end of the season when it was cheap to stay there, and they would stay there for a few months, then they would go on and on and on. He lived in Paris, and eventually he lived in London. So he was really an international artist. So how does he look at Fortuny? Sargent painted this picture in 1882. It was his biggest success in the 1882 Paris Salon. It was the biggest painting he ever exhibited in the Salon. At the same time, he exhibited Madame X. He got a lot of praise for this. Madame X, he was damned to every point in the sun, and he moved to London. It was part of a big scandal, but this was his big career success in Paris. Now, Sargent became enamored with Spanish art in working with Carolus Duran. You had, in the case of Eakins, his teacher was, in the 1860s, was Jerome. For Sargent, it was Carolus Duran. And for Sargent, Carolus Duran, his advice was simple. Carolus Duran taught Sargent over and over again, look at House, look at Velázquez, but always come back to Velázquez. And this is Sargent's tribute portrait to Carolus Duran. It's also at the Clark Art Institute. Sargent made repeated visits to Spain, and he was living in Paris at the time. He had spent a lot of time in Paris. In Paris in the 1870s, there was a big wave of Hispanophilia. Carmen premiered in 1875. In 1880, during the 1870s, Sargent had been to Madrid often. He saw Las Meninas, and you can see the compositional similarities when Sargent went in the early 1880s to Venice. This treatment, and Eakins picked up on this too, background activity, foreground activity, a light focus in the background, the casual dispersal of figures, dark setting, again, the spotlight in the background. It was something that he absorbed when he was in Paris, and also the use of very intense darks. Sargent traveled in 1879 to both Spain and also Morocco. He spent a lot of time in Morocco, and this is one of the great pictures that came from that tour. And Sargent was very well aware of the work that Fortuny, the Orientalist work that Fortuny did in Morocco. And one of the things that Fortuny, who was a little bit older than Sargent, but famous in Paris at the time Sargent was a young man, and there was a great worship that Sargent had of Fortuny. Fortuny inspired Sargent to go to Morocco and study the otherness. So we have El Haleo. It's probably the best example of Hispanophilia that an American artist did. The picture was inspired by a 5-month trip Sargent made through Spain and North Africa in 1879. And chronologically and thematically, it comes at the same time as the Venice pictures. It has dramatic light effects, exotic models, and a restrained palette. Sargent was fascinated with the costumes and theatrical manner of Spanish dance in southern Spain. Sargent was immersed in Spanish culture, which Eakins was not. The name El Jaleo refers to both the broad meaning of jaleo in Spanish, which is a ruckus, as well as the specific dance known as the Jaleo to Jerez. It's broadly painted in a nearly monochromatic palette with lots of spots of red and orange. Sargent dramatized the contrast between the rich blacks and the shining whites of the dancer's skirt, caught in the strong footlights and painted briskly to suggest movement. The lighting also suggests the eerie shadows on the rear wall that compose nearly half the picture. It's probably the best example of Hispanophilia to come out of Paris in the 1870s and 1880s. Sargent exhibited in 1882. Thomas Jefferson Coolidge from Boston bought it. Isabella Stewart Gardner got it in 1914. It's daring, risky, unconventional, and erotic, but unlike Eakins, who looked at Spanish technique and composition, Sargent was diving directly into Spanish subject matter. We really don't know whether they were gypsies or not, or whether they were Spanish, but we know they're not French, and that what they are doing is naughty, if not utterly beyond the pale. I think the attraction to Sargent was the subject of the free spirit. Carmen was first performed in 1875. It scandalized the public with its tale of a proud, lusty gypsy torn between an army officer and a toreador. Now, Sargent loved the compositional opportunities it gave him, and it wasn't until the first decade of the 20th century that he was able to dive into lots of different ways of treating the subject, the figure. This is a picture that's in your show just to isolate the woman, and thinking of how chaste and how reserved and how passive Washington Allston's figure of the woman was from the 1830s. Sargent in the 1880s was using the Spanish woman to take a walk on the wild side. It was something that he could do with a Spanish subject that he certainly couldn't do, as he discovered with Madame X, with a French lady. Actually, Madame X was from New Orleans, but she was not. She was an establishment figure. Now, Sargent, again, towards the end of his career, this is a picture at the Addison from 1912, 1913. He borrows from, he keeps Fortuny in his file of artists that he loved and he thought of. In this series of pictures, A Gypsy Encampment, this picture is at the Addison. It's very similar to a lot of Fortuny genre pictures that were done in the 1860s of everyday life in Spain, with the ragtag buildings, the bright blue sky. A lot of Spanish mid-19th century genre pictures always had this one little funny sort of burlesque element to them. In this case, he's checking the teeth of donkey. So you can see the attraction to peasant subject matter, which was something that was very important to Fortuny. Sargent is coming back to it over and over again, but mostly from Spanish art and also from Fortuny, but from Velázquez particularly. Sargent got the convention of this glittery surface, this surface sparkle that is almost impressionistic, the little dabs of color that he uses over and over again. Now, the third artist I'll talk about is William Merritt Chase, who lived from 1849 to 1916. So again, you have an artist, Sargent, Eakins was born 1844, Sargent 1856, Chase 1849. Chase is known mostly as an American impressionist. He studied at the National Academy of Design. Unlike Eakins, Eakins studied in Paris. He went to study in Munich under the instructorship of Carl von Piloty. He started working in a dark style that had more to do with Dutch painting than anything else. For William Merritt Chase, Eakins, Fortuny was inspirational as an international artist, which is what Chase saw himself. He saw himself like Fortuny as drawing from an abundance of influences, a Moorish subject, Orientalist painting by Gérôme, Japanese art, French art, Italian art, genre pictures, and later for Chase, impressionism, to create an amalgam of flamboyant influences. He was very much a showman. His studio, like Fortuny's studio, was the subject of a lot of comment for its clutter, its antiquarian quality. This gives you an example. This is Fortuny's Antiquarian, which is a picture that William Merritt Chase knew quite well, and he tried to create the same kind of ambiance. These two pictures were on view last year by Fortuny, your picture by Fortuny, and Chase from 1894. Both of them have in common the direct encounter with nature and awareness of local color, lots of color shadows. Fortuny penetrated the moment, which is what Chase was after. Chase admired the largeness of Fortuny's vision and the fact that he could draw so freely and liberally from so many influences. Fortuny to Chase was a young internationalist, but he was also something of an outsider. He wasn't French, he was Spanish. He admired Fortuny's staging, and he admired Fortuny's organizational prowess as well. So where do we go from there? By the late 19th century, American artists began to travel more and more to Spain. Robert Henry, who, like William Merritt Chase and like Thomas Eakin, was one of the great art teachers of his generation, made an annual trip with his students to Spain. At the same time, in California, in Southern California, the new Anglo establishment promoted the long-gone Franciscan missions of the colonial period as emblems of deference to Anglo-style authority, capitalism, and respect for hierarchy. Ramona was the best-selling novel between Uncle Tom's Cabin and Gone with the Wind in the United States, and was written by Helen Hunt Jackson. The Mission Revival in Southern California, in the settlement of Southern California, the middle-class people who poured into California became part of the American heritage, the Mission Revival, part of the identity of Southern California. At the same time, Spanish culture was making a major incursion in New York with the founding of the Hispanic Society, one of the great museums in New York City, one of the unheralded museums that's reopening. It's the biggest collection of Spanish art outside of Spain itself. It's on 155th Street in Manhattan. It brought to New York City thousands of objects, a great library. Archer Huntington, the founder of the Hispanic Society, collected some of the greatest works of Spanish art that came on the market. And I'll end with Walt Whitman. At the turn of the century, social realist artists in New York, such as Robert Henry, Bellows, John Sloan, embraced the painting style of Velázquez, Goya, celebrating its democratization of humble life. Now, I want to talk about Walt Whitman, because I've always kept in my thoughts when thinking about the influence of Spanish art and American art, a letter Walt Whitman wrote in 1883. This is Eakins' portrait of Walt Whitman in response to the invitation he received from citizens of Santa Fe to speak at the city's 333rd anniversary, which is called a Tercio Millennial. The letter, written 50 years after Spanish Maiden Reverie, seems to reiterate a lot of themes that I've talked about. Whitman could hardly, he was an avant-garde writer. There was nothing really conservative about it. He was invited to speak at the ceremony. He turned it down, but he said something in his rejection letter that was very important in defining American national identity. He said, "We Americans have yet to really learn out our antecedents and sort them to unify them. They will be found ampler than has been supposed and in widely different sources. Thus far, impressed by New England writers and schoolmasters, we tacitly abandon ourselves to the notion that our United States have been fashioned from the British Isles only. Today, something outside of them and to counterbalance them is seriously needed. Whitman saw American nationalism as an evolving value system. The seething materialistic and business vortices of the United States, he wrote, in their present devouring relations, controlling and belittling everything else, are, in my opinion, but a vast and indispensable stage in the New World's development." But then he talked about American Spanish past. He talked about Spaniards as a nationality of noblest spiritual, heroic attributes. He commended the ingredients of Spanishness in American culture. To that composite American identity of the future, Spanish character will supply some of the most needed parts. No stock shows a grander historic retrospect, grander in religiousness and loyalty, or for patriotism, courage, decorum, gravity, and honor. It is time to realize, for it is certainly true, that there will not be found any more cruelty, tyranny, superstition in the resume of past Spanish history than in any corresponding resume of Anglo-Norman history. So Whitman seems to have taken a page from Washington Allston and articulating 50 years later a much overlooked thread in the history of American struggle with Spanishness. Eakins, Chase, Sargent accommodated this as well, looking at Fortuny and other Spanish artists. And so that's my talk. Good. Good. Any questions or comments or humorous anecdotes?